The war paint was still wet on their faces when the first arrow whistled past Catherine Brennan's ear, embedding itself deep into the wooden post beside her head with a sickening thud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had stepped off the dusty stagecoach at Fort Clearwater barely 5 minutes earlier, her heart already heavy with uncertainty about meeting the man who had promised to marry her through letters alone. Now, as Lakota warriors poured over the ridge like a dark tide, their war cries splitting the afternoon air, she realized her greatest fear wasn't about marrying a stranger anymore. Marcus Hartwell had been tracking the war party for 3 days through the pine-scented valleys of Wyoming Territory, his weathered face set in grim determination as he followed their trail through Blackstone Ridge. The signs were unmistakable: bent grass, scattered horse droppings, and the occasional moccasin print pressed into the soft earth near water sources. As a cavalry scout for Fort Clearwater, he had learned to read the land like scripture, every broken twig and disturbed stone, telling him a story that could mean life or death for the settlers in the valley below. The autumn of 1875 had been particularly brutal, with tensions between the expanding settlements and the native tribes reaching a boiling point that seemed to scorch the very air. Marcus had seen enough bloodshed in his 32 years to last several lifetimes, his soul carrying scars that ran deeper than the knife wound across his left shoulder or the bullet graze along his ribs. The war had taken everything from him: his parents in a raid 5 years prior, his faith in the promise of peaceful coexistence, and most recently, his ability to sleep through the night without jerking awake at the slightest sound. Fort Clearwater itself was a testament to mankind's stubborn refusal to surrender to the wilderness. Built from rough-hewn logs and surrounded by a palisade that seemed to dare the elements to test its resolve, it housed nearly 200 souls who had carved out their existence from the unforgiving frontier. The fort served as both military outpost and sanctuary for the scattered homesteaders who dotted the Pine Valley like seeds cast on rocky ground, hoping to take root despite the odds stacked against them. Marcus had ridden hard for the better part of the morning, his horses' flanks slick with sweat as they navigated the treacherous mountain paths that led back to the fort. Something in his gut told him the war party wasn't simply passing through their territory this time. The deliberate nature of their movement, the way they had circled back on their own trail twice to throw off pursuers, suggested a specific target rather than random raiding. His years of experience had taught him to trust these instincts, even when they painted a picture he didn't want to see. Billy Hartwell, his 19-year-old brother, was waiting by the fort's main gate when Marcus finally rode in, dust and exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. The boy had grown tall in the past year, his frame filling out with the kind of strength that came from hauling water barrels and splitting firewood, but his eyes still held that eager innocence that made Marcus's chest tighten with protective worry. Billy had been barely 14 when their parents died, and Marcus had practically raised him since then, trying to fill roles he had never been prepared for. "Any sign of them?" Billy asked, his voice tight with the kind of anxiety that had become commonplace around the fort in recent weeks. Reports of increased tribal activity had everyone on edge, from the seasoned soldiers to the newest arrivals, who still jumped at their own shadows. Marcus dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after hours in the saddle. "They're coming," he said simply, handing the reins to his brother. "Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but they're coming." He looked toward the fort's interior, where smoke rose from cooking fires and the sounds of daily life continued despite the underlying tension. "Get word to Colonel Grimm. Tell him we need to prepare the defenses." The mention of Colonel Thaddeus Grimm sent a familiar wave of disgust through Marcus's system. The man had arrived at Fort Clearwater 6 months earlier with impressive credentials. and a smile that never quite reached his cold grey eyes. Within weeks, it had become clear that Grimm saw his posting not as a duty to protect the frontier settlers, but as an opportunity to line his own pockets through various schemes involving supply contracts and land deals. Marcus had tried to raise concerns through proper channels, only to find himself increasingly marginalized and assigned to longer scout missions that kept him away from the fort for weeks at a time. As Billy hurried off to deliver the message, Marcus noticed the small crowd gathered near the fort's trading post. A stagecoach sat nearby, its sides caked with the kind of dust that spoke of long, hard travel across the territory. The sight wasn't unusual. Coaches arrived weekly, bringing supplies, mail, and occasionally new settlers brave enough or desperate enough to try their luck on the frontier. What caught his attention was the lone woman standing beside a modest collection of travel bags, her posture suggesting someone who was trying very hard to appear confident while battling considerable uncertainty. Catherine Brennan had never imagined that answering a newspaper advertisement for a mail-order bride would lead her to this moment, standing in a dusty fort yard surrounded by suspicious stares and whispered conversations. The journey from her small hometown in Ohio had taken the better part of a month, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar and deeper into a world that seemed determined to test her resolve at every turn. At 26, Catherine had been considered well past marriageable age by the standards of her community, her prospects dimmed by a combination of modest family circumstances and a stubborn independence that made suitable men look elsewhere for wives. When her father's death left her with mounting debts and few options, the carefully worded letter from James Morrison in Wyoming Territory had seemed like Providence itself. He had written eloquently about his successful ranch, his desire for a refined woman to share his life, and his willingness to provide the kind of security she desperately needed. The reality confronting her now bore little resemblance to the pictures her imagination had painted during the long journey west. James Morrison was nowhere to be seen, despite her letter clearly stating her arrival date. The fort itself, while larger than she had expected, had a rough, temporary quality that suggested civilization was still very much a work in progress in this part of the territory. Most unsettling of all were the undercurrents of tension she could sense in every conversation, every glance exchanged between the fort's residents. Catherine had dressed carefully for this first meeting, choosing her best traveling dress and taking extra care with her appearance, despite the rigors of stagecoach travel. She stood 5 feet and 6 inches tall, with chestnut brown hair that caught golden highlights in the afternoon sun, and green eyes that had been her one vanity since childhood. Her hands, though calloused from years of helping run her father's struggling general store, were clean and neatly gloved. She had practiced what she would say to James Morrison dozens of times during the journey, but now found herself facing an entirely different challenge. "Excuse me, miss," came a gravelly voice from behind her. Catherine turned to see an elderly man with a star pinned to his vest approaching with the careful gait of someone whose joints had seen too many hard winters. "I'm Judge Harrison Wade. I handle most of the legal matters here at Fort Clearwater, including marriage ceremonies when they're called for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm afraid I have some difficult news regarding James Morrison." Catherine's stomach dropped, though she tried to keep her expression composed. "Is he delayed? I sent word of my arrival date well in advance." Judge Wade removed his hat, revealing thin grey hair that matched the apologetic expression on his weathered face. "I'm afraid Mr. Morrison won't be coming at all, miss. Word came in yesterday that he was killed 3 weeks ago when his ranch was attacked. Lakota war party hit several homesteads north of here. I'm sorry to be the bearer of such news." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, though she fought to maintain her composure in front of the growing number of curious onlookers. In an instant, her carefully constructed plans crumbled into dust, leaving her stranded hundreds of miles from home with barely enough money for food, let alone passage back to Ohio. The debts she had fled would be waiting for her return, along with the pitying looks and whispered conversations about poor Catherine Brennan and her failed attempt to find a husband out west. "I see," she managed, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Is there perhaps a boarding house in the area where I might stay while I make arrangements?" Judge Wade's expression grew even more apologetic. "I'm afraid not, miss. Fort Clearwater isn't exactly set up for unattached ladies, if you catch my meaning. Most folks here are either military personnel or families who've been assigned housing. There's a stagecoach heading back east next week, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Catherine understood perfectly well that she lacked the funds for return passage, and even if she could somehow secure the money, returning home would mean facing the same impossible situation she had fled in the first place. The weight of her circumstances settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, but she refused to let despair show on her face. She had survived her father's illness, his death, and the subsequent financial collapse that had driven her west. She would find a way to survive this as well. Marcus had been watching the conversation from across the yard, something about the woman's dignified bearing in the face of obvious bad news, stirring a reluctant admiration in his chest. He had seen plenty of settlers arrive at Fort Clearwater. Over the years, their faces bright with dreams and expectations that the frontier was quick to crush. Most either adapted quickly to the harsh realities of their new life or found themselves on the next stage, heading back east. This woman seemed different somehow, her spine straight and her chin lifted despite whatever blow Judge Wade had just delivered. The sound of a bugle calling assembly interrupted his observations, followed immediately by shouts from the watchtowers that made his blood run cold. "Riders approaching from the north. War party!" The transformation of Fort Clearwater was instantaneous and terrifying. Soldiers ran for their weapons, while civilians scrambled for the safety of designated buildings. Children, who had been playing in the yard moments before, were swept up by their mothers and hustled indoors. The massive gates began swinging shut, their heavy iron hinges groaning under the weight of thick wooden beams that could stop anything short of cannon fire. Catherine found herself frozen in the middle of the chaos, her travel bags scattered at her feet as people rushed past her in all directions. The speed with which the peaceful afternoon had transformed into pandemonium left her reeling, her mind struggling to process the reality of imminent danger. She had read about Indian attacks in newspaper accounts, but those distant stories had never prepared her for the raw terror of actually facing such a threat. Marcus moved without conscious thought, his body responding to years of training and hard-won experience. He crossed the yard in long strides, his hand already reaching for the rifle slung across his back. "Ma'am, you need to get inside right now," he said, his voice cutting through the noise around them with calm authority. "The community hall is the safest place during an attack." Catherine looked up at him, taking in the weathered face and steady grey eyes of a man who clearly knew what he was talking about. There was something reassuring about his presence, a sense of competence that helped cut through her fear. "My bags," she said, gesturing toward her scattered belongings. "Leave them," Marcus replied firmly, then seemed to catch himself. In one smooth motion, he gathered her two most important-looking cases while keeping his rifle ready. "Come on, we don't have much time." The first arrows were already arcing over the fort's walls as Marcus guided Catherine toward the community hall, their iron points glinting in the afternoon sun like deadly stars. War cries echoed from the surrounding hills, growing louder, and more numerous with each passing second. The Lakota war party that Marcus had been tracking had arrived with perfect timing, catching the fort during the vulnerable afternoon hours when many of the soldiers were off duty and the gates had been open for normal traffic. Inside the community hall, Catherine found herself pressed against walls alongside 24 other civilians, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and grim determination she felt building in her own chest. Children clung to their mothers, while men checked weapons and peered through the narrow windows that offered limited views of the yard outside. The building had been constructed with defense in mind, its thick log walls and minimal openings designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. Marcus positioned himself near the main window, his experienced eye already assessing the developing attack. Through the narrow opening, he could see Lakota warriors moving with practiced efficiency, some providing covering fire while others attempted to scale the fort's walls or find weaknesses in its defenses. These weren't desperate raiders looking for easy targets. They were skilled fighters executing a coordinated assault that spoke of careful planning and strong leadership. "How many?" asked Sergeant Pete Donovan, a grizzled veteran who had served with Marcus on numerous scouting missions. Pete had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite during a winter patrol, but he could still shoot straighter than most. Men with all their digits intact. Marcus continued his assessment, counting muzzle flashes and movement patterns. "At least 40, maybe more. They've got us surrounded, but they're concentrating their main push on the north wall." He glanced around the room, taking note of which civilians might be able to help with the defense if things got desperate. "This isn't a raid, Pete. They're trying to take the fort." The implications of that statement settled over the room like a cold fog. Raids were brutal but brief affairs, with attackers seeking to inflict maximum damage before withdrawing to safety. A coordinated assault on a military installation suggested something far more serious, either a major escalation in the conflict between settlers and tribes, or specific intelligence that made Fort Clearwater a particularly valuable target. Catherine pressed herself against the wall, near where Marcus had positioned himself, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The sounds of battle were growing louder outside, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire and shouted orders from the fort's defenders. Through the window, she caught glimpses of figures moving across the yard, some in the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers and others in the buckskins and war paint of Lakota warriors, who had somehow breached the outer defenses. "What happens if they get inside?" she asked Marcus, keeping her voice low enough that the children in the room wouldn't overhear. Marcus looked at her directly for the first time since guiding her to safety, taking in the intelligence in her green eyes and the way she was asking practical questions instead of dissolving into panic. "Then we fight," he said simply, "and we hope the cavalry patrol gets back from their mission before things get too desperate." The sound of splintering wood from somewhere nearby made everyone in the room tense, followed by triumphant war cries that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. Marcus cursed under his breath, recognizing the signs of a successful breach in the fort's defenses. Through the window, he could see smoke beginning to rise from one of the storage buildings, the orange glow of flames visible even in the afternoon sunlight. "They're in," Sergeant Donovan said grimly, checking his ammunition supply. North Wall must have given way. Marcus made a decision that went against every instinct developed through years of military service. Instead of staying to coordinate the defense of the community hall, he turned to Catherine with an expression that mixed apology with determination. "I need to get out there and help organize the defense. If things go bad, if they break through these walls, you take that rifle in the corner and you use it. Don't hesitate, don't think about it. Just shoot anything that comes through that door that isn't wearing a blue uniform." Catherine nodded, surprised by her own calmness in the face of such instructions. What about you? I'll be back, Marcus said, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. Just stay alive until I can get back to you. As Marcus slipped out of the community hall and into the chaos of the battle raging across Fort Clearwater's yard, Catherine found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken in just the past few hours. She had arrived expecting to meet a prospective husband and begin a new chapter of domestic tranquility. Instead, she was trapped in a building under siege, holding a rifle she had never fired and placing her trust in a man whose name she didn't even know. The irony wasn't lost on her that after traveling hundreds of miles to find security through marriage, she now found herself relying on her own strength and the protection of a stranger who owed her nothing. As the sounds of battle intensified outside and smoke began seeping under the community hall's door, Catherine Brennan realized that whatever happened in the next few hours would either kill her or transform her into someone entirely different. From the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach just an hour earlier, the first phase of her new life on the frontier was ending in fire and violence, but somewhere beneath her fear, Catherine felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years, the fierce determination to survive and fight for her own destiny, regardless of what the world tried to take from her. The battle for Fort Clearwater raged for 3 brutal hours before the attacking war party finally withdrew into the gathering dusk, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would haunt the survivors for years to come. Marcus had fought his way across the compound twice, rallying defenders and plugging gaps in their lines wherever the Lakota warriors had pressed their assault most fiercely. His uniform was torn and bloodstained, a shallow gash across his forehead, marking how close death had come to claiming him during the fierce fighting near the ammunition storehouse. When the last war cry faded into the distance and the defenders finally dared to believe the attack was truly over, Marcus made his way back to the community hall with legs that felt like they were made of lead. His rifle hung loose in his grip, the barrel still warm from constant use, while his mind struggled to process the carnage he had witnessed. Good men had died today. Friends he had served alongside for years, reduced to still forms, covered by hastily gathered blankets. Catherine met him at the door of the community hall, her green eyes wide with concern as she took in his battered appearance. She had spent the entire battle pressed against the window, watching the chaos unfold in the yard below, while clutching the rifle he had instructed her to use if necessary. Several times she had seen him moving through the smoke and gunfire, his tall form distinctive even amid the confusion of combat. "You're hurt," she said, noting the blood that had dried along his temple and the way he favored his left side when he walked. Marcus touched the wound on his forehead absently, as if he had forgotten it existed until she mentioned it. "Nothing that won't heal," he replied, though the exhaustion in his voice suggested the day's fighting had taken a heavier toll than just physical injuries. "Are you all right? Did anyone get hurt in here?" Catherine shook her head, gesturing toward the other civilians who were slowly emerging from their makeshift shelter. "We were fortunate. The walls held, and your soldiers kept them away from this building." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of how closely she was looking at him. "You saved us all today." The praise made Marcus uncomfortable in a way that enemy gunfire never did. He had simply done his job, the same as he had been doing for years on the frontier. Survival required everyone to contribute what they could, and his contribution happened to involve fighting. There was nothing heroic about it in his mind, just the grim necessity of staying alive in a world that seemed determined to test that resolve at every opportunity. "Colonel Grimm wants to see you," Sergeant Donovan said, approaching with the careful gait of a man who had taken a bullet through his left thigh during the fighting. "Soon as you're able to walk that far." Marcus nodded, though the prospect of facing Grimm in the aftermath of such a costly battle filled him with dread. The colonel had been conspicuously absent during the worst of the fighting, reportedly coordinating the defense from the safety of his quarters while his men bled and died in the compound. Marcus had seen enough of war to know that leadership, failures during crisis moments, revealed character in ways that peacetime never could. "I should tend to that cut," Catherine said, surprising both men with her offer. "I helped care for the wounded back home when the cholera outbreak hit our town. It's not much, but I know how to clean a wound properly." Marcus found himself nodding before he had consciously decided to accept her help. There was something about her calm competence in the face of chaos that reminded him of the army medics he had known, men who could work steadily on terrible injuries while bullets whistled overhead. "There's a medical kit in the supply room," he said, "if you're certain you don't mind." The fort's supply room had taken damage during the attack, its door splintered by an axe and several crates scattered across the floor where warriors had searched for useful items before being driven back. Catherine picked her way carefully through the debris, locating the medical supplies, while Marcus sat heavily on an upturned crate that served as a makeshift chair. As she cleaned the gash on his forehead with steady hands, Marcus found himself studying her face in the lamplight. There was a quiet strength in her features that hadn't been apparent when he first saw her standing beside the stagecoach, looking lost and uncertain about her future. The crisis had stripped away whatever pretenses she might have carried from her previous life, revealing someone who could function under pressure without falling apart. "How did you end up here?" he asked, more to distract himself from the sting of antiseptic than from genuine curiosity. Catherine's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their careful work. "I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. A man named James Morrison promised me security and a fresh start if I was willing to travel west and marry him." Her voice carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting a business transaction that had failed to materialize. "Judge Wade told you what happened to Morrison?" "Yes. Killed in a raid 3 weeks ago, along with several other ranchers north of here." She stepped back to examine her handiwork, apparently satisfied with how the bandage looked. "I suppose I should have expected something like this might happen. The frontier isn't exactly known for its predictability." Marcus appreciated that she wasn't looking for sympathy or expressing regret over her decision to come west. Too many settlers arrived with unrealistic expectations about frontier life, only to crumble when reality failed to match their fantasies. Catherine seemed to understand that adaptation was the price of survival, even if her particular circumstances were more challenging than most. "What will you do now?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Unattached women had few options at Fort Clearwater, and even fewer resources to exercise those options. Catherine folded the remaining medical supplies back into their kit with the same methodical precision she had used to clean his wound. "I don't know yet. Judge Wade mentioned a stagecoach heading east next week, but I don't have the fare. And even if I did, going back would mean facing the same problems that drove me to leave in the first place." The practical nature of her dilemma appealed to Marcus's straightforward approach to problem solving. She wasn't asking for charity or expecting someone else to solve her difficulties, just acknowledging the reality of her situation without dramatic flourishes. "There might be work available here at the fort," he said carefully. "Nothing fancy, but enough to earn your keep while you figure out your next move." Catherine's eyes met his, and he saw a flash of hope, quickly tempered by caution. "What kind of work?" "Cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, helping with the wounded when we have them. Fort Clearwater always needs people who can handle practical tasks without needing constant supervision." Marcus found himself warming to the idea as he spoke. "The pay isn't much, but it includes meals and a place to sleep." The offer was Impulsive, driven more by instinct than careful consideration. But something about Catherine's competence during the crisis convinced him she would be an asset rather than a burden. The fort had lost 2 of its civilian workers in the attack, leaving gaps that needed to be filled if the community was going to continue functioning effectively. "I accept," Catherine said without hesitation. "When do I start?" Her quick decision caught Marcus off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. A woman in her position had little room for prolonged deliberation when offered a lifeline. "Tomorrow morning, I suppose. I'll speak to Judge Wade about the arrangements." The sound of boots approaching interrupted their conversation, followed by Colonel Grimm's voice calling Marcus's name with the particular tone officers used when they were displeased about something. Marcus rose from his makeshift seat, automatically straightening his posture despite his exhaustion and injuries. Colonel Thaddeus Grimm entered the supply room with the measured stride of a man who had spent his career cultivating an image of military bearing. His uniform was immaculate despite the recent battle, his graying moustache perfectly waxed, and his cold grey eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs of Grimm's moods, and everything about the colonel's demeanor suggested trouble ahead. "Hartwell," Grimm said, his voice clipped and formal, "I need a full report on today's engagement, including your assessment of how the enemy managed to breach our defenses so effectively." Marcus nodded, though he suspected Grimm already knew the answers to most of his questions. "They came in with superior numbers and better coordination than we've seen before. Someone gave them detailed intelligence about our defensive positions and patrol schedules." Grimm's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes that made Marcus's instincts prickle with warning. "Are you suggesting we have a spy within the fort?" "I'm suggesting they knew exactly when and where to hit us for maximum effect," Marcus replied carefully. "That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident." The colonel's gaze shifted to Catherine, who had been listening to their exchange with obvious interest. "And who might this be?" "I don't recall authorizing any civilians to have access to military supplies." Catherine stepped forward before Marcus could respond. Her chin lifted in a gesture of quiet defiance that reminded him of how she had faced the hostile crowd at her arrival. "I'm Catherine Brennan. I was tending to Sergeant Hartwell's wounds. With his permission." "Miss Brennan was providing medical assistance," Marcus added, his voice carrying just enough edge to suggest he wouldn't tolerate any disrespect toward her. "She has experience treating injuries." Grimm's smile was thin and calculating, the expression of a man who had found a new angle to exploit. "How convenient. And what brings Miss Brennan to our remote outpost?" "I came to marry James Morrison," Catherine replied steadily. "Since that's no longer possible, I've accepted employment here at the fort." "Have you indeed?" Grimm's tone suggested he found her statement amusing rather than informative. "And who exactly offered you this employment?" Marcus felt the conversation sliding into dangerous territory, but there was no retreating now. "I did, with the understanding that Judge Wade would handle the administrative details." The colonel's laugh was sharp and humorless. "How generous of you, Sergeant. Unfortunately, all personnel decisions at Fort Clearwater require my approval, and I'm afraid we have no positions available for unattached women at this time." The dismissal was clear, but Catherine refused to be intimidated. "I'm willing to work for minimal compensation, Colonel, just enough to cover basic necessities while I make other arrangements." Grimm studied her with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating livestock at market. "I'm sure you are, Miss Brennan. However, unattached women tend to create disruptions in military communities, distractions that can prove costly during times of crisis." Marcus felt anger building in his chest, though he kept his expression neutral. Grimm's real objection, had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with maintaining control over every aspect of life at Fort Clearwater. An independent woman with her own source of income would be harder to manipulate or intimidate than someone completely dependent on the colonel's goodwill. What if she wasn't unattached? Marcus heard himself saying, the words emerging before. His conscious mind had fully processed the implications. Both Grim and Catherine stared at him, though their expressions reflected very different emotions. The colonel's eyebrows rose in sardonic amusement, while Catherine's face showed a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. "Are you proposing to Miss Brennan, Sergeant?" Grim asked, his tone suggesting he found the entire situation highly entertaining. Marcus looked at Catherine, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her green eyes. The proposal was impulsive and probably foolish, driven more by anger at Grim's casual cruelty than by any deeper emotion. But as he studied her face, noting the intelligence there and remembering her calm competence during the crisis, he found the idea less absurd than it should have been. "If she's willing," he said quietly. Catherine's response came without hesitation, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." Grim's expression shifted from amusement to something harder and more calculating. A married couple would be more difficult to manipulate than isolated individuals, especially if the husband was a competent soldier with the respect of his fellow enlisted men. Marcus had unwittingly created a potential obstacle to whatever schemes the colonel was pursuing. "How romantic," Grim said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "I suppose congratulations are in order. Judge Wade can perform the ceremony tomorrow morning, assuming you're both certain about this momentous decision." The colonel's easy acceptance made Marcus suspicious, but there was no backing down now without losing face and leaving Catherine vulnerable to whatever petty retaliation Grim might devise. "We're certain," he said firmly. After Grim departed with a promise to inform Judge Wade of the upcoming nuptials, Catherine and Marcus found themselves alone in the damaged supply room, the reality of their impulsive decision settling between them like an uninvited guest. "You didn't have to do that," Catherine said finally, her voice soft but steady. "I could have found another way." Marcus picked up a fallen crate and set it upright, using the activity to buy time while he organized his thoughts. "Maybe, but Grim would have made things difficult for you regardless. At least this way you have some protection." "Is that all this is? Protection?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. Marcus had grown accustomed to frontier life's practical approach to most problems, where sentiment was a luxury few could afford. Marriage as a protective arrangement was common enough, though he had never expected to find himself in such a situation. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know you handled yourself well today, better than a lot of people who've been here much longer. I know you're not looking for someone to solve all your problems or make your life easy." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "And I know I'd rather have you as a partner than see you forced to leave because Grim decides you're inconvenient." Catherine nodded slowly, as if his answer had confirmed something she had been hoping to hear. "I won't be a burden to you, Marcus. I can pull my own weight, contribute to whatever life we build together." The use of his first name caught his attention, though he couldn't say exactly why. "I never thought you would be," he replied. "If I had, I wouldn't have made the offer." They spent the next few hours working together to clean up the supply room, their conversation gradually shifting from the weighty subject of their upcoming marriage to more practical matters like inventory replacement and security improvements. Catherine proved to have a systematic approach to organization that complemented Marcus's more intuitive methods. And by the time they finished, the room was in better order than it had been before the attack. As they worked, Marcus found himself paying attention to small details he had missed during their earlier interactions. The way Catherine's hands moved with confident efficiency, whether she was sorting medical supplies or stacking ammunition boxes, the thoughtful expression she wore when considering how to arrange items for maximum accessibility, the quiet satisfaction. She took in completing tasks thoroughly rather than simply getting them done. "Where did you learn to organize like this?" he asked as they secured the last of the repaired inventory. Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that made Marcus realize how little he had seen her smile since her arrival. "My father owned a general store back in Ohio. I helped him run it from the time I was old enough to reach the higher shelves. You learn quickly that good organization can mean the difference between profit and failure." "What happened to the store?" Her smile faded, replaced by the practical acceptance he was beginning to recognize as her default response to difficult subjects. "Father got sick, and the medical bills ate up most of our savings. After he died, I couldn't keep up with the debts on my own. Creditors were ready to take everything, so I sold what I could and used the money to come west." Marcus nodded, understanding now why she had approached their arrangement with such pragmatic acceptance. Catherine had already lost one life to circumstances beyond her control. She wasn't about to let sentiment or false pride prevent her from building another. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Leaving everything behind to come out here?" Catherine considered the question seriously, her gaze drifting toward the window where the last light of evening was fading into full darkness. "I regret that my father didn't live to see me settled and happy, but coming west." She shook her head. "No, I don't regret that. Whatever happens, at least I'm making my own choices now, instead of just reacting to other people's decisions." The comment struck Marcus as particularly insightful, touching on something he had felt but never articulated about his own relationship with frontier life. The constant danger and uncertainty were offset by a sense of agency that civilized society, often denied, especially to people without wealth or influential connections. As they prepared to leave the supply room, Catherine turned to face him with an expression that mixed determination with vulnerability. "I want you to know that I understand what tomorrow means. This isn't a romantic fairy tale or a love match made in heaven. We're two people choosing to face whatever comes next together instead of alone." Marcus found himself appreciating her candor more than any flowery declaration of affection could have moved him. "That's more honest than most marriages start with," he replied. "And honesty seems like a good foundation for whatever we're building." Catherine's smile returned, smaller this time but somehow warmer. "Then we understand each other." As they walked across the compound toward their respective sleeping quarters, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in the space of a single day. This morning, he had been a solitary man, focused solely on survival and duty, his emotional world carefully contained to prevent further loss. Tonight he was preparing to marry a woman he had known for less than 24 hours, based on nothing more than mutual respect and shared pragmatism. The strangeness of the situation should have troubled him more than it did, but Marcus found himself oddly at peace with the decision. Catherine Brennan had proven herself capable under pressure, honest about her circumstances, and willing to work for what she wanted rather than simply hoping someone else would provide it. Those qualities mattered more on the frontier than romantic love or social compatibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, including the inevitable complications that arose whenever Colonel Grimm felt his authority threatened. But tonight, for the first time in years, Marcus Hartwell went to sleep, knowing he wouldn't be facing those challenges alone. Judge Harrison Wade performed the marriage ceremony at dawn, his weathered hands holding a leather-bound Bible that had seen more frontier weddings than any book had a right to witness. The ceremony took place in the fort's chapel, a modest building that served double duty as meeting hall and courtroom when circumstances required. Marcus stood beside Catherine in his cleaned and mended uniform, while she wore the best dress. From her traveling collection, a simple blue garment that brought out the color of her eyes in the early morning light. Billy Hartwell served as witness, his young face serious with the gravity of the occasion. He had spent most of the previous evening bombarding Marcus with questions about married life, though his brother's answers had been less than illuminating, given his own inexperience with the subject. Sergeant Pete Donovan hobbled in on his wounded leg to offer his congratulations, along with a handful of other soldiers who respected Marcus enough to attend, despite the unconventional circumstances. Colonel Grimm was notably absent from the ceremony, though his influence hung over the proceedings like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Several of the fort's civilian residents had also chosen to stay away, their absence speaking volumes about the social complications Catherine would face as the wife of an enlisted man who had openly defied their commanding officer's wishes. Do you, Marcus Hartwell, take Catherine Brennan to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? Judge Wade's voice carried the authority of countless similar ceremonies, though his eyes held a warmth that suggested genuine hope for their happiness. Marcus looked at Catherine as he spoke his vows, noting the steady way she met his gaze without flinching or looking away. "I do," he said, meaning it more than he had expected when he woke that morning. Catherine's voice was clear and strong. When her turn came, her words carrying across the small chapel with conviction that surprised even her. "I do," she said, and felt something shift inside her chest as the words left her mouth. Judge Wade pronounced them husband and wife with a smile that reached his eyes, then closed his Bible with the satisfaction of a man who had just accomplished something genuinely meaningful. "You may kiss the bride," he said, though his tone suggested he understood this might not be that kind of marriage. Marcus hesitated for just a moment before leaning down to brush his lips gently against Catherine's, a chaste kiss that somehow managed to convey both respect and possibility. When they separated, Catherine felt her cheeks warm with something that wasn't quite embarrassment, but wasn't entirely comfortable either. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Wade said, shaking both their hands with genuine enthusiasm. "May you find happiness together in whatever comes next." The name caught Catherine off guard, though she realized she should have expected it. Mrs. Hartwell. After 26 years of being Catherine Brennan, she was now someone entirely different, at least on paper. The change felt both monumental and strangely anticlimactic, like stepping across a threshold into a room that looked remarkably similar to the one she had just left. Billy approached them after the other well-wishers had departed, his expression mixing excitement with something that might have been concern. "Does this mean Catherine's going to live with us now?" he asked Marcus, using her first name with the easy familiarity of youth. Marcus glanced at Catherine, realizing they hadn't discussed the practical arrangements of their new living situation. His quarters at the fort consisted of a single room, barely large enough for one person, let alone a married couple. "We'll need to speak with the quartermaster about larger accommodations," he said. "Actually," Judge Wade interjected, "there's a small cabin just outside the fort's main compound that's been sitting empty since the Hendersons moved back east last month. It's not much, but it's got 2 rooms and a decent stone fireplace. Might suit your needs better than military quarters." The offer was appealing, though Marcus suspected it came with complications he hadn't yet considered. Living outside the main compound would provide privacy and independence, but it would also mean less protection if trouble arose again. Given Colonel Grimm's obvious displeasure with their marriage, isolation might prove more dangerous than inconvenient. "We'd appreciate the chance to look at it," Catherine said before Marcus could voice his concerns. Something in her tone suggested she understood the risks, but was willing to accept them in exchange for the benefits of having their own space. The Henderson cabin sat on a small rise about 200 yards from Fort Clearwater's main gate, positioned to take advantage of morning sunlight while remaining within easy reach of the compound's defenses. The structure itself was solidly built from local timber, with a stone foundation that spoke of permanence rather than temporary shelter. 2 rooms, as Judge Wade had promised, along with a small kitchen area and a sleeping loft that could accommodate additional family members if circumstances required. Catherine walked through the empty rooms with the practiced eye of someone who had managed household arrangements before, mentally cataloging what would be needed to make the space livable. The previous occupants had left behind some basic furniture, including a sturdy table and 2 mismatched chairs that showed the wear patterns of daily use. The fireplace was well constructed, with a chimney that drew cleanly and a hearth wide enough to accommodate both cooking and heating needs. "It has potential," she said finally, running her fingers along the windowsill to check for gaps that would need to be sealed before winter arrived in earnest. "With some work, it could be quite comfortable." Marcus found himself watching her evaluate their potential home with growing respect for her practical approach to problem solving. Where many women might have focused on aesthetic concerns or complained about the cabin's rustic simplicity, Catherine was clearly thinking about functionality and efficiency. She understood that comfort on the frontier was earned through careful planning and hard work, not wishful thinking. "The roof looks sound," he observed, noting the quality of the repair work that had been done to replace damaged shingles. "And the walls are thick enough to keep the wind out during winter storms." Catherine nodded, already mentally arranging furniture and planning improvements that would make the space more livable. "We'll need supplies, of course. Basic household items, food stores, proper bedding." She paused, seeming to remember that their marriage was as much a practical arrangement as a romantic one. "I have a little money saved from selling my father's store. Not much, but enough to get us started." The offer touched Marcus more deeply than he would have expected. Catherine was proposing to invest her limited resources in their shared future, despite knowing him for less than 2 days. The gesture spoke to a level of trust and commitment that went beyond mere convenience. "We'll pool what we have," he said. "My army pay isn't much, but it's steady, and I've managed to save most of it over the years since I don't have many expenses." They spent the rest of the morning making lists and planning the practical details of setting up their household, their conversation growing more comfortable as they discovered shared approaches to organization and resource management. Catherine's experience running her father's store complemented Marcus's military training in logistics, creating a partnership that seemed likely to function effectively despite its unconventional origins. The first sign of trouble came that afternoon when Billy arrived at the cabin with news that Colonel Grimm wanted to see Marcus immediately. The boy's expression was worried, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. "He didn't say what it was about," Billy reported, "but Sergeant Donovan thinks it has something to do with yesterday's battle report. The colonel's been asking a lot of questions about how the Lakota knew exactly where to hit us." Marcus felt his stomach tighten with familiar dread. Grimm's investigations had a way of finding scapegoats rather than solutions, and Marcus's marriage to Catherine had already put him in the colonel's crosshairs. "Did he say when he wanted to see me?" "Right away," Billy replied, "and he specifically said you should come alone." Catherine looked up from the inventory list she had been writing, her expression sharpening with concern. "That doesn't sound encouraging." Marcus shook his head, already reaching for his hat and checking that his sidearm was properly secured. "Grimm doesn't like being embarrassed, and yesterday's attack made him look incompetent. He's probably looking for someone to blame besides himself. Be careful, Catherine said, the words carrying more weight than a simple caution. She was already thinking like a wife, Marcus realized, concerned about threats to their partnership before it had even truly begun. Colonel Grimm's office occupied the finest quarters at Fort Clearwater, with windows that provided commanding views of the surrounding terrain and furnishings that spoke of wealth and privilege rather than military functionality. The colonel sat behind an imposing desk made from polished oak, its surface covered with maps, reports, and correspondence that suggested the breadth of his administrative responsibilities. "Ah, Hartwell," Grimm said without looking up from the document he was reading. "Please have a seat. I trust married life is treating you well so far." Marcus remained standing, recognizing the false courtesy that typically preceded Grimm's more unpleasant pronouncements. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Grimm finally looked up, his cold gray eyes studying Marcus with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Indeed I did. I've been reviewing the reports from yesterday's engagement, and several disturbing patterns have emerged." The colonel rose from his chair and walked to a large map mounted on the wall, pointing to various locations marked with colored pins. The attacking force knew exactly where our weak points were located. They coordinated their assault to hit us when our defenses were most vulnerable. Most troubling of all, they seemed to have detailed knowledge of our patrol schedules and guard rotations. Marcus nodded, having reached similar conclusions during his own analysis of the battle. "It suggests they had inside information, sir. Someone familiar with our operations provided intelligence that made their attack possible." "My thoughts exactly," Grimm said, turning to face Marcus with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something darker. "The question, of course, is who might have provided such information." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he realized where Grimm's investigation was headed. "Are you suggesting that I'm a traitor, Colonel?" Grimm's smile was thin and predatory. "I'm suggesting that your recent behavior has been highly irregular. Your marriage to that woman, for instance. Very convenient timing, wouldn't you say? She arrives just hours before a major attack, and you immediately propose marriage to someone you've never met before." "I married Catherine to protect her from your harassment," Marcus said bluntly, abandoning any pretense of military courtesy. "Nothing more complicated than that." The colonel's expression hardened at the direct challenge to his authority. "Did you indeed? And how do we know that Mrs. Hartwell, isn't exactly what she appears to be? A woman traveling alone to the frontier with a convenient story about a dead fiancé?" Marcus felt anger building in his chest, though he forced himself to remain calm. Grimm was fishing for reactions, looking for any sign of guilt or deception that could be twisted to support whatever narrative he was constructing. Catherine Brennan's story checks out completely. Judge Wade confirmed Morrison's death and verified her correspondence with him. "Documents can be forged, Sergeant. Stories can be fabricated." Grimm returned to his desk and opened a leather folder withdrawing several sheets of paper. "What's more difficult to explain away is this." He held up what appeared to be a military dispatch, though Marcus couldn't read the contents from his position across the room. "This is a report from our scouts south of here, describing unusual activity along traditional Lakota hunting routes. Activity that suggests coordination between different tribal groups, the kind of alliance that would be necessary to mount an attack like yesterday's." Marcus waited, sensing that Grimm was building towards some kind of accusation, but uncertain what form it would take. "The interesting thing about this report," Grimm continued, "is that it was filed 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks, Sergeant. Which means we had advance warning of increased tribal activity, information that should have been used to strengthen our defenses and increase our readiness." "I never saw that report, sir," Marcus said carefully. "No, you didn't. because it was classified. Information restricted to senior command staff only. Grimm's smile returned, colder than before. Yet somehow, the attacking force seemed to know that we weren't prepared for a coordinated assault, almost as if someone had told them that our intelligence gathering had failed to result in improved defenses. The accusation was becoming clearer, though Marcus still couldn't see how Grimm intended to make it stick. "Are you suggesting I had access to classified information, Colonel?" "I'm suggesting that you've been asking a lot of questions lately about patrol schedules, defensive positions, and supply deliveries. Questions that could seem innocent from a dedicated soldier, but might have different implications when viewed in the context of yesterday's attack." Marcus felt the trap closing around him, recognizing Grimm's strategy even as he struggled to find an effective counter. The colonel was using Marcus's own competence and attention to detail as evidence of treason, twisting normal military behavior into something sinister. "My questions were part of doing my job effectively, sir. A scout needs to understand overall operations to provide useful intelligence." "Perhaps," Grimm acknowledged, "or perhaps you were gathering information for other purposes. Information that you passed along through intermediaries, such as your new wife." The accusation against Catherine sent rage coursing through Marcus's system, though he managed to keep his voice level. "My wife had nothing to do with yesterday's attack. She was as surprised by it as anyone else." "Was she? Or did she simply play her part very convincingly?" Grimm leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying Marcus's discomfort. "A woman traveling alone to marry a stranger, arriving just hours before a major assault, immediately ingratiating herself with key personnel. It's almost too convenient to be coincidental." Marcus realized that defending Catherine directly would only reinforce Grimm's suspicions, so he tried a different approach. "What evidence do you have beyond speculation and timing?" Grimm's expression suggested he had been waiting for exactly that question. "I have testimony from several reliable witnesses who observed you and your wife engaged in detailed conversations about fort operations, supply deliveries, and defensive preparations. Conversations that took place in locations where they could have been overheard by unauthorized personnel." "The accusation was cleverly constructed," Marcus admitted grudgingly. Anyone who had seen him talking with Catherine about practical matters related to setting up their household could be made to sound suspicious under the right interpretation. Grimm was twisting innocent domestic planning into evidence of espionage. "Those conversations were about household arrangements," Marcus said. "Nothing more." "So you claim. Unfortunately, I can't take that risk." Grimm stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the fort's compound with the air of a man making difficult but necessary decisions. "Effective immediately, you're relieved of all scouting duties pending a full investigation into your activities. You'll remain confined to the fort until this matter is resolved." The punishment was severe, but not unexpected given the seriousness of Grimm's accusations. Marcus had seen other soldiers destroyed by similar investigations, their careers and reputations ruined by suspicions that could never be fully disproven. "What about my wife, sir?" Grimm turned back to face him, his expression mixing false regret with barely concealed satisfaction. "Mrs. Hartwell is free to remain at Fort Clearwater for now, though she'll be under observation. Any attempt to leave the area will be considered evidence of guilt." Marcus nodded stiffly, recognizing that further argument would only make their situation worse. "Is that all, Colonel?" "For now, you're dismissed, Sergeant. I suggest you use this time to consider whether there's anything else you'd like to tell me about your recent activities." Marcus left Grimm's office with his mind racing, already planning how to protect Catherine from the colonel's machinations, while clearing his own name. The accusations were serious enough to result in court-martial proceedings if Grimm could manufacture sufficient evidence, and Marcus had no doubt that the colonel was fully capable of doing exactly that. Catherine was waiting for him at the cabin, her expression shifting from hopeful to concerned as she read the tension in his face. What happened? Marcus closed the door behind him and checked the windows to make sure they weren't being observed, before explaining Grimm's accusations and the restrictions that had been placed on their movements. Catherine listened without interruption, her face growing more serious as the implications became clear. "He's using our marriage as evidence against both of us," she said when Marcus finished his account, "making it seem like we're conspirators rather than people trying to build a life together." Marcus nodded, appreciating that Catherine grasped the political dimensions of their situation immediately. Grimm doesn't need proof, just enough suspicion to justify whatever action he wants to take, and he definitely wants us gone. Catherine was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the fort's compound, while her mind worked through the problem. "What if we could prove that someone else provided the intelligence for yesterday's attack?" she asked finally. "How would we do that? Grimm controls the investigation, and he's already decided we're guilty." Catherine turned to face him, her green eyes bright with determination. "Maybe he controls the official investigation, but that doesn't mean we can't conduct our own. You know this fort better than anyone, Marcus. You know who has access to sensitive information, who might have reasons to betray their fellow soldiers." The suggestion was dangerous, potentially making their situation even worse if they were caught investigating on their own. But Marcus found himself drawn to Catherine's logic. Sitting passively while Grimm built his case against them seemed like a certain path to disaster, while active investigation at least offered the possibility of uncovering the truth. It would have to be someone with access to patrol schedules and defensive plans, Marcus said, beginning to think through the possibilities. Someone who could communicate with hostile forces without being detected. Catherine nodded, already developing a more detailed plan. "And someone who would benefit from seeing you discredited or removed from Fort Clearwater. Who has Grimm been favoring lately? Who might profit from your disgrace?" As they began to list potential suspects and develop strategies for investigating them, Marcus realized that his hasty marriage had provided him with something he hadn't expected. A true partner in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Catherine's sharp mind and practical approach to problem-solving were exactly what he needed to navigate the treacherous waters Grimm had created. The stakes were rising rapidly, with their freedom and possibly their lives hanging in the balance. But for the first time since leaving Grimm's office, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope that they might find a way to emerge from this crisis stronger than before. The investigation Catherine and Marcus launched into the true source of intelligence. Leaks at Fort Clearwater began with careful observation of daily routines and subtle questioning of soldiers during off-duty hours. Catherine proved particularly adept at extracting information from unsuspecting sources, her status as a newcomer allowing her to ask seemingly innocent questions about fort operations without raising immediate suspicion. Within 3 days of beginning their covert investigation, they had identified several troubling patterns in the behavior of Lieutenant James Crawford, Colonel Grimm's aide-de-camp and most trusted confidant. Crawford had access to virtually all sensitive information that passed through the colonel's office, including patrol schedules, supply manifests, and intelligence reports from scouts operating throughout the territory. More significantly, he had been making regular trips to Willowbrook settlement under the pretense of coordinating civilian supply deliveries, journeys that would have provided ample opportunity for clandestine meetings with hostile contacts. Catherine had been the first to notice Crawford's suspicious behavior, observing him during her daily visits to the fort's commissary to purchase household supplies. The lieutenant's nervous demeanor and tendency to end conversations abruptly, when others approached, suggested someone carrying the weight of guilty secrets. His expensive personal effects, including a gold pocket watch and fine leather boots that far exceeded what an officer's salary could reasonably afford, hinted at additional sources of income that warranted investigation. Marcus contributed his knowledge of Crawford's military record and personal history, painting a picture of an ambitious officer frustrated by slow promotion and resentful of more successful colleagues. Crawford had applied repeatedly for transfer to more prestigious postings in the East, only to be rejected due to mediocre performance evaluations and reports of poor judgment under pressure. Such disappointments could easily have motivated him to seek alternative paths to wealth and advancement, even if those paths led through treasonous territory. Their investigation took a dangerous turn when Marcus discovered that Crawford had been systematically copying sensitive documents from Colonel Grimm's files, using his position as aide-de-camp to access information well beyond his official responsibilities. Marcus observed this activity during a late-night visit to the administrative building, ostensibly to retrieve personal effects from his former office. Hidden in the shadows of the supply room, he watched Crawford carefully transcribe patrol routes and defensive positions onto separate sheets of paper, which he then concealed within his personal correspondence. The evidence was compelling, but incomplete, lacking the definitive proof needed to clear their names and expose Crawford's betrayal. More critically, their investigation had attracted unwanted attention from Colonel Grimm, who began assigning additional guards to monitor their activities and restrict their access to potentially sensitive areas of the fort. The noose was tightening around them, with Grimm's official investigation gaining momentum, while their own efforts to uncover the truth faced increasing obstacles. Everything changed on a cold Tuesday morning when Billy Hartwell burst into their cabin with news that sent ice through Marcus's veins. The boy had been helping with stable duties when he overheard Lieutenant Crawford speaking in hushed tones with the civilian trader who had arrived the previous evening. The conversation concerned an upcoming supply convoy that would be traveling the northern route to Fort Clearwater, carrying ammunition and medical supplies desperately needed after the recent attack. They were talking about the convoy like they already knew it was going to be attacked, Billy reported, his young face pale with the implications of what he had witnessed. Crawford told the trader that it would be taken care of by Thursday morning, and that the army would blame it on random raiding just like all the others. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he realized the full scope of Crawford's betrayal. The lieutenant wasn't just selling intelligence about fort defenses, he was actively coordinating attacks on military supply lines, ensuring that Fort Clearwater remained vulnerable and undersupplied. The recent assault on the fort had likely been just one element of a larger campaign designed to weaken the military presence in the region while enriching Crawford through payments from hostile forces. Catherine immediately grasped the urgency of their situation. "We have to warn someone about the convoy," she said. "Those supplies are critically needed, and the soldiers escorting them will be walking into an ambush." Marcus nodded, though. He recognized the terrible dilemma they faced. Warning the authorities about the planned attack would require revealing their own investigation, potentially exposing them to charges of insubordination or worse, if Grimm chose to interpret their actions as evidence of guilt rather than patriotism. Yet remaining silent would mean allowing good soldiers to die in a trap they could have prevented. "There's more," Billy continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I heard Crawford tell the trader that after the convoy attack, there would be another assault on the fort itself. Something about finishing what they started during the last battle. The revelation sent shockwaves through Marcus's system as he realized that Fort Clearwater was facing not just isolated attacks, but a coordinated campaign designed to eliminate the military presence in Pine Valley entirely. Crawford's treason extended far beyond simple intelligence selling. He was actively participating in what amounted to warfare against his own command. Catherine stood abruptly, her mind already working through the tactical implications of Billy's intelligence. "How many people know about this conversation besides you?" she asked the boy. Billy shook his head. "Nobody else was around when I heard them talking. They were being real careful to keep their voices down, but I was close enough to make out most of what they said." Marcus felt the weight of command decisions settling on his shoulders, despite his current status as a soldier under investigation. The safety of the supply convoy and the fort's defenders trumped any personal considerations about his own legal jeopardy. "We need proof," he said finally. "Something concrete that will force Grimm to take action regardless of his suspicions. About us." Catherine was already moving toward their small collection of personal belongings, retrieving a leather satchel that contained writing materials and other essentials. "Crawford has to have documentation somewhere, records of his payments or correspondence with his contacts. Men like him are careful about protecting themselves, which means keeping evidence that could implicate others if things go wrong." The plan that emerged from their desperate consultation was audacious and extremely dangerous. Catherine would create a distraction that would draw Crawford away from his quarters, while Marcus searched for the evidence they needed to expose the lieutenant's treason. Billy would serve as lookout, positioned to warn them if anyone approached Crawford's building during their covert operation. The timing had to be perfect, with Crawford's regular evening routine providing their only window of opportunity. The lieutenant typically spent an hour each evening in the fort's officers' mess, socializing with his fellow officers and maintaining the facade of loyal service that concealed his true activities. During that time, his quarters would be unguarded and accessible to someone with Marcus's skills at covert movement. Catherine's role required her to approach Crawford directly, engaging him in conversation long enough for Marcus to complete his search. The risk to her was considerable, particularly if Crawford suspected that his activities had been discovered. But Catherine insisted on taking the assignment, arguing that her status as a civilian and recent arrival made her less likely to arouse immediate suspicion. As evening approached, Marcus found himself struggling with doubts about the wisdom of their plan. The potential consequences of being caught were severe, ranging from court-martial proceedings to summary execution if Grimm chose to interpret their actions as enemy espionage. Yet the alternative, allowing more soldiers to die in Crawford's carefully orchestrated ambushes, was equally unacceptable. Catherine seemed to sense his internal conflict as they made final preparations for their covert operation. "We don't have a choice, Marcus," she said quietly. "If we do nothing, people will die, and Crawford will continue selling information until this entire region falls under hostile control." Marcus nodded, knowing she was right, but still tormented by the risks they were taking. If something goes wrong, if you're discovered or threatened, you run. Don't try to be heroic. Just get yourself to safety. Catherine's smile was warm, despite the gravity of their situation. "The same applies to you. We're partners now, which means we both have responsibilities to survive whatever comes next." Brit. The officers' mess was crowded that evening, with most of Fort Clearwater's commissioned personnel gathering to discuss the day's activities and share what little gossip penetrated their isolated community. Catherine approached the building with carefully rehearsed casualness, her appearance drawing immediate attention from officers who rarely encountered unattached women in their social spaces. Lieutenant Crawford was seated at a corner table with two other junior officers, his expensive pocket watch gleaming in the lamplight as he gestured animatedly during some story about his experiences in previous postings. Catherine positioned herself strategically near the bar, close enough to observe Crawford, while maintaining the appearance of simply waiting for service. When Crawford rose to refill his drink, Catherine intercepted him with a smile that mixed feminine charm with calculated innocence. "Lieutenant Crawford, I'm Catherine Hartwell, Marcus's wife. I wanted to thank you for your kindness during our recent difficulties." Crawford's response was immediate and telling, his face flushing with what appeared to be guilt rather than pleasure at the introduction. "Mrs. Hartwell, of course. How are you adjusting to life at Fort Clearwater?" Catherine launched into a carefully prepared conversation about domestic arrangements and her impressions of frontier life, keeping Crawford engaged while Marcus made his way through the shadows toward the lieutenant's quarters. The building that housed junior officers was poorly lit and lightly guarded, with most residents gathered in the mess hall for their evening socializing. Crawford's room was spartanly furnished, but meticulously organized, with personal belongings arranged with military precision that spoke of obsessive attention to detail. Marcus worked quickly through the lieutenant's desk and personal effects, searching for the evidence that would prove Crawford's treasonous activities while listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate discovery. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered a hidden compartment in Crawford's writing desk, cleverly concealed behind a false back that required precise manipulation to access. Inside were dozens of documents that told the complete story of Crawford's betrayal. Correspondence with tribal leaders outlining intelligence exchanges, detailed maps showing convoy routes and timing, and most damning of all, receipts for substantial payments received in exchange for military secrets. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, painting a picture of systematic treason that extended back months before the recent attack on Fort Clearwater. Crawford had been selling information about military operations throughout the territory, directly contributing to successful attacks on supply convoys, isolated outposts, and civilian settlements. The scope of his betrayal was staggering, representing one of the most serious breaches of military security Marcus had ever encountered. As Marcus carefully photographed the most critical documents using a small camera he had borrowed from the fort's intelligence office, he heard footsteps approaching Crawford's building. Moving quickly to the window, he saw Catherine walking rapidly across the compound, her posture suggesting urgency rather than casual movement. Behind her, at a distance that suggested pursuit rather than coincidence, came Lieutenant Crawford and two other officers. Marcus gathered the evidence he had collected and prepared to exit through Crawford's window, but the sound of voices in the hallway outside indicated that his escape route had been compromised. Crawford was returning to his quarters earlier than expected, possibly because Catherine's questions had aroused his suspicions about her true intentions. The situation deteriorated rapidly as Crawford's voice became audible through the door, engaged in heated conversation with his companions about security concerns and unauthorized personnel accessing restricted areas. Marcus realized that he was trapped in the room with explosive evidence of Crawford's treason, facing discovery that would likely result in immediate arrest or worse. Catherine's voice joined the conversation in the hallway, her tone suggesting she was attempting to diffuse whatever suspicions Crawford had developed about her earlier approach. Marcus could hear her explaining that she had simply wanted to express gratitude for the lieutenant's assistance during her difficult arrival at the fort. But Crawford's responses suggested growing paranoia about her motives. The door handle turned as Crawford prepared to enter his quarters, unaware that Marcus was concealed inside with evidence that could destroy the lieutenant's carefully constructed facade of loyalty. Marcus positioned himself behind the door, knowing that his only chance lay in neutralizing Crawford before the lieutenant could raise an alarm that would bring the entire fort's security apparatus down upon them. Crawford entered his room with the casual confidence of a man in familiar surroundings, only to freeze as he noticed subtle signs that his personal effects had been disturbed. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm as his military training overcame his initial shock. But Marcus was faster, striking with the precision of a veteran soldier who had learned that hesitation meant death. The brief struggle that followed was vicious but decisive, with Marcus's superior size and combat experience overwhelming Crawford's desperate resistance. Within moments, the lieutenant was unconscious on his own floor, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, where Marcus's blow had connected with surgical precision. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined, as she took in the scene before her. "Is he alive?" she asked, checking the hallway to ensure they hadn't been observed. Marcus nodded, already gathering the evidence he had discovered. While considering their next moves, "He'll have a headache when he wakes up, but nothing permanent. We need to get this information to someone who can act on it before Crawford's contacts realize their operation has been compromised." The challenge now lay in finding an authority figure willing to listen to their accusations against a fellow officer, particularly given their own status as suspects in Grimm's investigation. The evidence was compelling, but presenting it would require them to admit to conducting unauthorized surveillance and breaking into Crawford's quarters without proper authorization. Catherine seemed to read his thoughts as they prepared to leave the compromised building. "Judge Wade," she said, simply. "He performed our marriage ceremony, and he has the authority to convene emergency proceedings if the evidence justifies it." Marcus considered the suggestion, recognizing both its potential and its risks. Judge Wade was respected throughout the territory for his integrity and fairness, but he was also bound by legal protocols that might prevent him from acting quickly enough to prevent the planned attacks on the supply convoy and fort. As they slipped through the shadows toward Judge Wade's residence, carrying evidence that could clear their names while exposing one of the most serious security breaches in Fort Clearwater's history, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed. Since Catherine's arrival, what had begun as a simple act of compassion toward a stranded woman had evolved into a partnership that was now fighting for survival against forces that threatened everything they had begun to build together. The stakes had never been higher, with their personal freedom and the safety of their fellow soldiers hanging in the balance. But for the first time since Colonel Grimm had leveled his accusations against them, Marcus felt the possibility of victory rather than mere survival. They had the truth on their side, along with evidence that could expose the real traitor in their midst. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of Fort Clearwater and everyone who depended on its protection. As they approached Judge Wade's door with their explosive revelations, Marcus squeezed Catherine's hand and felt her squeeze back, a silent acknowledgement that they would face whatever came next as true partners in every sense of the word. Judge Harrison Wade examined the damning evidence spread across his kitchen table with the methodical precision of a man who had spent decades weighing testimony and evaluating claims of innocence and guilt. The documents Catherine and Marcus had retrieved from Lieutenant Crawford's quarters painted an unmistakable picture of systematic betrayal that reached far beyond simple intelligence leaks. Crawford had been orchestrating a campaign of coordinated attacks designed to eliminate military resistance throughout the Pine Valley region, selling detailed operational intelligence to hostile forces while enriching himself through payments that dwarfed his military salary. The old judge's weathered hands trembled slightly as he examined correspondence between Crawford and tribal war leaders, letters that outlined specific targets for future attacks and provided precise timing for supply convoy movements. The scope of the lieutenant's treason was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications for every soul who called Fort Clearwater home. "This evidence is conclusive," Wade said finally, his voice heavy with the gravity of the situation they faced. "Crawford has been systematically compromising military operations for months, directly contributing to the deaths of soldiers and civilians throughout the territory." Marcus felt a surge of vindication mixed with urgent concern for the immediate threats still facing the fort. "The supply convoy is scheduled to depart at dawn, sir. If Crawford's contacts proceed with their planned ambush, every soldier in that escort will be walking into a death trap." Wade nodded grimly, already reaching for his coat and hat. "We need to wake Colonel Grimm immediately and present this evidence. Regardless of his personal feelings about your marriage or his suspicions about your loyalty, he cannot ignore proof of this magnitude." Catherine placed a restraining hand on the judge's arm as he prepared to leave. What if Grimm refuses to listen? What if he dismisses the evidence as fabricated or claims we planted it to deflect suspicion from ourselves? The question struck at the heart of their dilemma, highlighting the precarious position they occupied despite possessing irrefutable proof of Crawford's guilt. Grimm's investigation had invested considerable effort in building a case against Marcus and Catherine, and admitting their innocence would require the colonel to acknowledge serious errors in judgment that could damage his career and reputation. Wade considered Catherine's concern carefully before responding. Grimm may be arrogant and misguided, but he's not stupid. Evidence of this quality speaks for itself, and ignoring it would make him complicit in Crawford's treason if more attacks succeed. The judge's expression hardened with determination. "Besides, I have legal authority to convene emergency proceedings if military command fails to act appropriately on credible evidence of treason." The confrontation with Colonel Grimm took place in his private quarters, with the colonel roused from sleep to face accusations that shattered his carefully constructed narrative about Fort Clearwater's security breaches. Grimm's initial reaction was predictable hostility toward Marcus and Catherine, but his demeanor shifted dramatically as Wade methodically presented the evidence they had gathered. Crawford's correspondence with enemy agents was particularly damaging, revealing not only the lieutenant's role in coordinating attacks, but also his contempt for his fellow soldiers and his commanding officers. In one particularly inflammatory letter, Crawford had described Grimm as a pompous fool whose incompetence makes my work easier, and promised his contacts that the colonel's arrogance would prevent him from recognizing the true source of intelligence. Leaks until it was too late to prevent Fort Clearwater's complete destruction. The insults to his character and competence struck Grimm like physical blows, his face flushing with rage as he realized how thoroughly he had been manipulated by his trusted aide. The colonel's anger was compounded by the humiliating recognition that his investigation of Marcus and Catherine had been not just misguided, but actively harmful to fort security, diverting attention from the real traitor while that traitor continued his deadly work. "Where is Crawford now?" Grimm demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Marcus glanced at Catherine before responding. "Unconscious in his quarters, sir. He discovered my presence during the search and attempted to resist apprehension." Grimm's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications of Marcus's statement. "You conducted an unauthorized search of an officer's quarters and physically assaulted a fellow soldier." Judge Wade intervened before Marcus could respond to what was clearly a leading question. Sergeant Hartwell acted to prevent the escape of a confirmed traitor whose continued freedom posed an immediate threat to fort security. Given the urgency of the situation and the compelling evidence of Crawford's guilt, his actions were both justified and necessary. The legal backing provided by Wade's statement seemed to deflate some of Grimm's hostility, though the colonel's expression remained thunderous as he absorbed the full implications of Crawford's betrayal. His aide had played him perfectly, using access to sensitive information to orchestrate attacks, while simultaneously directing suspicion toward loyal soldiers, whose only crime had been asking inconvenient questions. "The supply convoy," Catherine interjected, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "According to Crawford's correspondence, the attack is planned for tomorrow morning along the northern route. If we don't warn them or change their route, dozens of soldiers will die." Grimm nodded curtly, his military training overriding personal embarrassment as he focused on immediate tactical necessities. "I'll dispatch riders immediately to intercept the convoy and redirect them to a safer route. We'll also need to apprehend Crawford before he can warn his contacts that their operation has been compromised." The arrest of Lieutenant Crawford proved anticlimactic compared to the dramatic revelations that had preceded it. The lieutenant regained consciousness to find himself surrounded by armed soldiers and faced with irrefutable evidence of his treasonous activities. His initial attempts at denial quickly crumbled when confronted with his own correspondence, and within an hour, he had confessed to orchestrating multiple attacks on military targets throughout the region. Crawford's confession revealed the full scope of his betrayal, including detailed information about planned future attacks and the identities of his contacts within various tribal groups. The intelligence he provided would prove invaluable in preventing additional ambushes and protecting civilian settlements that had been targeted for destruction. More importantly for Marcus and Catherine, Crawford's admission of guilt completely exonerated them from any suspicion of treasonous activity. Colonel Grimm was forced to publicly acknowledge that his investigation had been misdirected and that the couple had actually performed valuable service to Fort Clearwater by exposing the real traitor in their midst. The public vindication came during a formal ceremony held in the fort's main assembly hall, with the entire garrison gathered to witness Grimm's official apology and recognition of Marcus and Catherine's contributions to fort security. The colonel's words were carefully chosen and diplomatically phrased, but their meaning was unmistakable. Marcus Hartwell was a loyal soldier whose dedication to duty had saved countless lives, and Catherine Hartwell was a valuable addition to the Fort Clearwater community, whose intelligence and courage had helped expose a dangerous enemy agent. Billy Hartwell beamed with pride as his brother received formal commendation for his role in uncovering Crawford's treason, while Catherine found herself welcomed into the fort's social circles by women who had previously regarded her with suspicion and hostility. The transformation in their social standing was dramatic and immediate, replacing isolation with acceptance and turning former enemies into allies. Sergeant Pete Donovan approached them after the ceremony with a grin that stretched from ear to ear despite the pain from his still-healing leg wound. "I always knew you two were special," he said, shaking Marcus's hand with enthusiasm. "Takes real character to keep fighting for the truth when everyone else is ready to believe the worst about you." The weeks that followed brought a series of successful military operations based on intelligence provided by Crawford's confession. Several planned attacks on civilian settlements were prevented. Supply convoys reached their destinations safely using alternative routes, and the tribal alliance that Crawford had helped coordinate began to fracture as their intelligence advantage disappeared. Marcus found himself restored to full duty with additional responsibilities that reflected his proven competence and loyalty. Colonel Grimm, chastened by his near-catastrophic errors in judgment, began consulting with Marcus on security matters and defensive planning. The relationship between the two men remained formal and somewhat strained, but it was built on mutual respect rather than suspicion. Catherine established herself as an indispensable member of the Fort Clearwater community, using her organizational skills and practical experience to improve everything from supply management to medical care for wounded soldiers. Her marriage to Marcus evolved from a practical arrangement into a genuine partnership built on shared challenges overcome and mutual respect earned through adversity. The cabin they shared became a gathering place for other couples at the fort, with Catherine's cooking and Marcus's storytelling drawing regular visitors who appreciated the warmth and hospitality the Hartwells provided. Their home represented something precious on the frontier, a place where people could gather safely, share their burdens, and find comfort in community bonds that transcended military rank or social background. The threat of large-scale coordinated attacks diminished significantly following Crawford's exposure and arrest, though individual incidents of violence continued to occur throughout the territory. The difference was that Fort Clearwater now had accurate intelligence about genuine threats, rather than being vulnerable to manufactured crises orchestrated by internal enemies. Marcus and Catherine's investigation had revealed not just Crawford's individual betrayal, but also weaknesses in the fort's security procedures that allowed such betrayal to continue undetected for months. Colonel Grimm implemented new protocols for handling sensitive information and monitoring personnel with access to critical intelligence, changes that significantly improved overall security for the installation and surrounding communities. The success of their partnership in exposing Crawford's treason strengthened Marcus and Catherine's marriage in ways that conventional courtship could never have achieved. They had faced mortal danger together, trusted each other with their lives, and emerged victorious through combined effort and unwavering mutual support. The foundation of their relationship was built on proven reliability rather than romantic sentiment, creating a bond that could weather whatever challenges the frontier might present. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility that seemed to permeate every aspect of life at Fort Clearwater. The gardens Catherine planted behind their cabin flourished in the warming sunshine, while Marcus's expanded duties as senior scout provided both professional satisfaction and financial security for their growing household. Catherine discovered she was carrying their first child in late April, news that filled both of them with joy, tempered by the practical recognition that frontier life presented unique challenges for raising children. They began planning modifications to their cabin that would accommodate a growing family, working together with the same methodical cooperation that had characterized their investigation of Crawford's treason. Billy Hartwell embraced his upcoming role as uncle with enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on overwhelming excitement. The young man had matured considerably during the months of crisis and resolution, developing the kind of steady character that would serve him well as he transitioned from boyhood to adult responsibilities. Marcus took pride in watching his brother grow into someone who could be trusted with important duties and relied upon during difficult situations. The territorial government eventually recognized Marcus's service with a formal commendation and promotion to the rank of Master Sergeant, along with a cash award that allowed the Hartwells to purchase additional land adjacent to Fort Clearwater. The property would provide space for farming and livestock that could supplement Marcus's military income, while giving Catherine productive work that utilized her organizational abilities and practical experience. As autumn painted the Pine Valley in brilliant colors of gold and crimson, Marcus and Catherine stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over mountains that no longer seemed quite so threatening or hostile. The challenges of frontier life remained real and constant, but they faced those challenges as true partners who had proven their ability to overcome adversity through combined effort and unwavering commitment to each other. Catherine's hand rested on her growing abdomen as she contemplated the future they were building together, while Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed since that chaotic afternoon when a mail-order bride had stepped off a dusty stagecoach into the middle of an Indian attack. What had begun as a simple act of compassion toward a stranded stranger had evolved into something far more precious, a love built on trust, respect, and shared purpose that had already survived tests that would have destroyed weaker partnerships. The fort's evening bugle call echoed across the valley, signaling the end of another day in their carefully constructed new life. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and new opportunities, but Marcus and Catherine Hartwell would meet them together, as they had met every obstacle since their improbable first meeting. They had found something rare and valuable on the frontier. Not just survival, but the chance to build a life worth living in partnership with someone who truly understood the price of happiness in an unforgiving world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.